That war took a terrible toll beyond the 58,000 who died there. Many, many more thousands died afterwards from things, either mental or physical, that afflicted them as a result of that war.
Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to have our very first guest of Our Voices Matter be Rob Fersh, the founder of Convergence Center for Policy Resolution based in Washington, D.C. And when you hear Rob talk about the mission of the organization, you'll understand why I wanted this to kick us off, because the whole point of this podcast is exactly what Convergence has been doing for the last 9, almost 10 years now. So Rob, please tell our audience all about Convergence.
Well, thanks, Linda. First, a pleasure to be here with you and delighted to have this opportunity. Convergence is about 10 years old. Actually, it's an idea I've been working on for 20 years, which is to try to bring together people who disagree on big national issues, but people who have the collective knowledge, experience, and influence that if they could reach agreement can move the dial. Unfortunately, we've had success on issue after issue where people who disagree on education policy or on healthcare policy or how to increase economic opportunity actually can bridge their divides and find answers that are better than any of them started with when they first came to the table. So that's the vision of this, is to create trust across people who have differing points of view, find powerful areas of common ground, allow them to still fight about a lot of stuff they disagree on, but understand that underneath it all, most people want the same things, but just disagree on how to get there.
I just am totally in love with this whole concept of how you go about doing it. So I was first introduced to Convergence a couple of years ago when you and your team came to Houston to start to spread the word here and in other cities around the country about what you're doing, trying to get outside the Beltway. And I was taken immediately with the mission. So much so that I am now, full disclosure, a board member of Convergence, a brand new board member, and excited to be a part of the organization. Share with the audience, Rob, please, some of the successes that you have already had. Give us just one example of bringing two people together from opposite ends of the spectrum and how they ended up coming together.
Sure, I think our flagship program, which we're about to spin off as an independent nonprofit, was on the issue of K through 12 education. Even 6, 7 years ago, there were all sorts of articles and even books written, one called Class Warfare, which identified how broken the education system was. People were blaming teachers, people were blaming the testing regime, people were blaming liberals, they were blaming conservatives. People thought computers were the answer, people thought that social and emotional learning was the answer, and we overall, we're failing too many of our kids about what we could do for them to get them ready for life, to succeed in careers and succeed as citizens. So we did about a year's worth of research, created a map of who believed what, and eventually our talented team, assisted by all the people we interviewed, said we better do something to reimagine what education could be like. And that was unifying. And so we brought together, that vision was unifying. We brought together teachers' unions at the national level, charter school networks, public school officials, school administrators, companies like Lego and Disney and IBM and others, Microsoft, all came to the table because they had a sense that we could do something better for our kids. And what has emerged is a common vision for what we could do to transform American elementary education. Not only that, when they were done, they were so excited about what they'd come up with, a sense of a learner-centered education, that they asked us to keep convening them so they could work together over time. And now they are taking this vision out collectively across the country, where people in school districts and schools and communities across the country are embracing this as a potential way to really make a big difference at a time when we no longer need schools to do what they used to do. We no longer need the factory model.
So give us a sense of what happens when you've got, say, somebody from the teachers union and somebody from charter schools, and you've got all these different stakeholders that you just talked about. When you first get them in a room to sit down, what is that dynamic like? Take us into that room.
Well, I will tell you that on the first day of that particular session, and it's not always true, there was real tension in the room. I wasn't sure there'd be a second day, because some age-old rivalries came out, some anger came out, some people's feelings got touched one way or another.
Was there yelling?
I'd say it was heated.
Heated? Okay.
I wouldn't say it was yelling exactly, but it was heated. But we were able to calm it down. And what we already knew from all the interviews we'd done in advance was that these people wanted the same things for kids. They wanted them to thrive. They wanted an education system that responded to the 21st century, where their skills and dispositions about how to lead their lives, how to be successful in careers, how to be good citizens, it's no longer about filling this empty vessel with knowledge. Kids have on their phones, on their bodies, all the knowledge they probably will need, or a lot of the knowledge. And we needed to have a different approach that actually met the needs of each child. And every child has different needs. So as much as we can adapt the system to allow our education to meet their needs, while at the same time observing minimum standards, that became the watchword. And frankly, it was exciting to everybody. Teachers began to see there might be a doorway out of the intense pressures they have on the testing regime and a way to relate to kids more fully. And people who were concerned about career paths and so on, who weren't getting students out of a lot of schools who had the skills they needed, saw that this could produce another level of learning and preparation by these kids.
So over what period of time did these conversations take place before you finally got to a point where you could reach some consensus and move forward as you have?
So the period of time is it took us a long time to map out all the different positions and players, but once we brought them together, that took about a year, but would be less if we had been more robustly funded, but at the time we were on a skeleton. Then it was a period of about 18 months where they had 6 meetings. We created an arc of meetings, identified really what the goals were and the principles by which they wanted to operate by, and then together they wrote a document, a vision document for learner-centered education that's been embraced by people on the left and right and in between. The beauty of it is that it's not partisan, it's not prescriptive. It's a notion of we can transform how we educate kids, and it can be widely embraced by people who believe in charter schools, private schools, public schools. It's about how do we get through to children and prepare them for life in a much more effective way.
Right.
And again, these people are modest. They view it as a draft. They know things can get better, but it's a change in direction that's fundamental and quite exciting.
So one of the other signature projects that Convergence has undertaken has to do with economic mobility. I remember being at one of the meetings, I guess a year or so ago, when a representative from Walmart was there. Talk to me about that project as it relates to, you know where I'm going with this, right? I want you to talk about the two people who came together after not being together at the very beginning.
Well, this is not unusual for us, that people come to the table skeptically. Some come because they're afraid that if they're not there, they won't be able to protect their interests. Some come because they're curious and interested. But at the one session you mentioned, there was a woman who has done a lot of work to protect the rights of low-income workers and had been very skeptical and frankly critical of Walmart over the years. And what she said at that session was that I came to this table, but the one person I most want to watchdog was the person sitting next to her at this session, who was from Walmart, a senior official from Walmart. At that point, she paused, they looked at each other, and they spontaneously, as only women can do, put their heads together and kind of hugged each other. Because what they'd learned in that moment is that they wanted the same thing for workers. They wanted opportunity. And each had a different perch and opportunity to do so. But as they discussed what people need in order to move up the economic ladder, the education they need, the flexible hours, at times the leave they need, they found they had a lot in common, and they began to understand the constraints each was under and began to work out areas of powerful common ground. And I think they both were deeply changed by that experience. They could no longer see each other the same way. And I think the nice thing about our process is I suspect they will work together over time differently, not just in terms of issuing our one report at one time. I think people attain a certain level of understanding and compassion for each other that they really can talk to each other differently over time. And so that's part of what we do, is not just try to come up with great solutions, but build a more civil society in the process.
You are clearly so passionate about this subject matter, and you've devoted this part of your life to seeing this through. Talk a little bit about your backstory. How did you get here? What were you doing leading up to this, and why did you feel so compelled to start Convergence 10 years ago?
Yeah, well, thanks for that question, Linda. The truth is, I was raised in a middle-class family in Poughkeepsie, New York. My father was a guidance counselor and guidance director, my mother a dental hygienist. And I was kind of raised to believe that morality, both my religion, which is Judaism, morality itself required me to be a liberal. And I went into the world that way, thinking that the higher ground was there. And obviously, I went to college during tumultuous years, and I got concerned about issues like poverty and racism, and I threw myself into those issues. And whatever my political beliefs are today, they are. Those are my personal beliefs. But here's what life threw at me. I kept meeting people of such great decency who kept making points I never thought of, who wanted to solve the same problems I did. And I began to see that the orthodoxy of liberalism or conservatism was inherently insufficient. That in fact, as we lead our lives and our marriages and our families, whatever we do, no one side, no one person has all the answers. So I was suffering from a cognitive dissonance in that I felt like I should have allegiance to my original points of view in life and my friends, who all believe the same things. And yet at some level, when you meet people who are thoughtful and caring and as decent as anyone else, you have to open your minds and hearts to them. And that's really the origins of Convergence, is creating deep relationships with people I disagreed with, learning from them, understanding the limits of what I knew. I'm about to brag about how humble I am about my own beliefs. And that's really the origins. I came to Washington to end poverty in America. That was my passion. And my normal line is I had a huge influence. Things are a lot worse now. But over time, I've learned that the better answers will emerge when people can talk to each other. People who disagree can push each other's thinking to another level. And I've now seen that over and over again in our projects, that people leave our projects not feeling compromised. They usually feel that what they came up with was actually better than what they started with. And that's really exciting. And they also leave our projects not feeling the levels of animosity they felt toward other people who they blindly dislike without even knowing them before.
You mentioned your work with poverty. You also did work on the Hill. Talk a little bit about your background as it relates to Congress, and then kind of how that's converged, if you will, into where you're working now. Yeah,
good leading question. Thank you for that. So part of why I do what I do came from my work in Congress. I worked on the Senate side for the Senate Agriculture Committee. And there I staffed a bipartisan coalition dealing with the nation's nutrition programs. And Bob Dole, who was then eventually the majority leader in the Senate, but also very active on the Agriculture Committee, was working closely with a senator who's still there, Senator Patrick Leahy, for whom I worked. And we forged bipartisan coalitions to deal with the school lunch program, the WIC program, and the food stamp program. That was an eye-opener for me, because Senator Dole had once been seen as a fierce partisan. He had been chair of the Republican Party, I believe, during the Nixon years. And here was a person who cared, who was decent, who brought a different perspective. So I learned from that you can't generalize and stereotype people. The other side is I then went to work on the House side for then Representative Leon Panetta, who later became a big national name, working in the Clinton administration and the Obama administrations. And I guess my favorite story there, which is very directly related to Convergence, is I was invited to be the staff director of a House subcommittee on nutrition. It had jurisdiction over what was then called the food stamp program, now known as SNAP, and other nutrition programs. And there were reports in the 1980s of increased hunger in America during the early years of the Reagan administration. And I was told, working for Leon Panetta, you'll love that, but you'll never be able to work with the ranking minority member of the subcommittee, a Republican, by the name of Bill Emerson of Missouri. They said he's a Reagan Republican. There's nothing you can do with him, because the usual liberal assumption was that conservatives had no compassion. Well, it turned out to be nothing could be further from the truth of that. Bill and Leon agreed to go out and hold field hearings across the country. They visited soup kitchens and food pantries guided by Republican and Democratic mayors. They learned together, they absorbed what they saw. We had pizza and beer at night. We had conversations that led them to sponsor bipartisan legislation for years afterward because they had a bond of friendship and trust. And they merged their different points of view and found areas of common ground. And to me, that was demonstrative of what was possible. And again, broke through the stereotype that one particular political perspective had a monopoly on compassion or wisdom. So that was very much part of my, if you will, my learning that led to the formation of Convergence down the road.
So fast forward now to the congressional budget project that Convergence has undertaken.
Yeah.
So share with our audience what that's all about and where things are going, because you're having some success with that.
We're definitely having some success.
Believe it or not.
And the
right?
day we're taping this, actually, there was action today in Congress. So here's in a nutshell, it's a little arcane. A lot of eyes roll over, roll up, around. So whatever eyes do. What we did was organize a project that said whether you believe in higher taxes, lower taxes, more spending or not spending, there's probably a lot of common ground that the federal budget process is broken. Periodically, the government closes down. A lot of charities and other groups that rely on government funding can't get it on a timely basis. We hear there's a talent drain. Contractors won't necessarily contract with the federal government because the money isn't always there consistently. So we pulled together a group of people who at first said, federal budget process, and they rolled their eyes.
Yeah, right.
But eventually we learned that every one of them, whether they were veterans or people concerned about infrastructure, or the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, or taxpayers, or health groups, or any hunger groups, all felt a common frustration. And in the room, we built a level of trust amongst them where they designed a whole series of changes to the federal budget process that have become center stage in congressional deliberations. So in 2018, a joint select committee was established to prepare recommendations on how to fix the federal budget and appropriations process. So in November of 2018, they are supposed to report out their final recommendations. I'm sorry to say that there may be some politics involved, and they may or may not get it done as of this date.
Politics involved? Really?
But the politics have nothing to do with the substance. There's a series of ideas that could make the process more efficient, more timely, more responsive to the American public. And the truth is, to be honest, whatever process we design, they might still get around that mousetrap. And so people are skeptical, but why not improve the process? It hasn't really been under a deep overhaul for 30 or 40 years. And so our group got excited that maybe they could help the country function better. And they're all doing it as patriots, as people who believe the government ought to function better. Everyone from Americans for Prosperity, which is tied to the Koch brothers, to the American Taxpayers Union, to the Chamber of Commerce, to liberal entities, think tanks, and advocacy groups. And the nice thing about
all these groups came together. They
came together. And I'll tell you, when we took these ideas to the Hill, our group took it to the Hill, the first question is, what are you recommending? And the second question, they looked at us in bewilderment and said, how the hell did you get them to agree on, even to wish each other a good day, no less recommendations that are substantive? And so there's, again, lessons that people really can find.
So clearly the process is working.
Yeah.
And you have mentioned this word several times, and I know it's one of the first words in the mission statement, and that word is trust. You have to start with building trust before you can get to understanding what the commonalities are and then to come to some sort of consensus. How do you build that trust?
We're in Washington, so we don't, create campfires or do silly games like that. Here's the simplest thing. You get people to talk from their hearts about who they are. What do they care about? What are their values? What are their fears? What are their concerns? And sometimes within an hour, you have a sense like people know they're not actually enemies. They just disagree on how the world works. And that's the best way. And sometimes it's hard to disarm. There's some people come in hating each other to our processes and actually leave hating each other. But for the most part, I find that familiarity breeds affection. So if over time you create ground rules, we don't allow people to question each other's motives, you stay on topic, You don't hog the time too much. You listen to each other. And if in between you have meals together, you learn about each other's families and your needs, and you share things. You're caring for an elderly family member, or you've got a child with special needs. You become more like your friends. And it's a lot harder for you to just go after someone's views when you see them as a whole human being. So that's where the trust comes from. There's no one special moment. I do have one favorite story, though, which I'll tell you.
Share it.
The first time I did this was before Convergence, but it was a proof of concept that helped lead to starting a Convergence. This is before we had the Affordable Care Act. In 2003 and 2004, I had an idea that was readily grabbed onto by people who could make this happen, that we ought to bring together people who disagreed about how we could provide health care coverage for everybody in the country. Everyone wanted that, left and right wanted to improve coverage, but as one colleague used to say, everybody's first choice was their own solution, and their second choice was the status quo. Well, after months of research, we assembled a very high-powered table on healthcare in this country. And we put people around the table for the first meeting, and I was scared about what would happen because I'd never done this before. As it turns out, a lot of the more progressive groups were at the table, and as we were around the table, we asked them, what do you care about? Why are you here? I found them to be very timid. They kind of said, because they were worried, because around the table was the Conservative Heritage Foundation and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and I think they were afraid of scaring them off by being too bold or saying too much. So I felt they pulled their punches, saying, oh, well, we've got a problem, not enough people are covered. And trust got built in that room when 2/3 around the table, a gentleman you now know who serves on our board because he was in that project, from the Heritage Foundation, Stuart Butler, said, I don't know about the rest of you, but I believe in universal health care coverage. So there it was, the Conservative Heritage Foundation saying something point blank in a way stronger and firmer than anybody else in the room had said it. And immediately the more liberal groups who always wanted universal health care coverage saw that it wasn't an enemy. Now Stuart went on to say, I probably believe in doing this more through market forces than a lot of you want more government, but let's have the conversation. By dinner time, I sensed a shift in the room. Defenses were coming down. There was a sense like, I really can talk to this person. And that helped create, in my view, a level of trust that stayed in that process, which had 12 two-day meetings in 2 years that came up with a series of recommendations that some would say helped lay the groundwork eventually for the Affordable Care Act.
Wow. So it took one person to be able to stand up and say, I believe in this. And even those who believed it but were a little timid, it's like everybody's afraid of what the reaction is going to be if they say what they truly think and believe, because they feel as though they're going to be vilified or pilloried just for expressing their opinion. Yeah. When did we get to this? How did we get here?
Well, I think it's a complicated story.
I expect you to answer that, Rob, definitively. Yeah. Please tell us.
Yeah, but I do think that's right. I think, especially in this day and age, in public settings, and there's a lot of good from the sunshine of putting government forward and having people see Congress operate, but I also feel like, there's no room to make mistakes. People end up showboating a little bit because the cameras are on and so on. So I think there's some detriments that arise from the fact that everything is out in the open. For us, we've got the ground rules. Everything in the room, it's Chatham House rules. You can't be speaking for attribution outside. You're allowed to make mistakes. You can correct the record. And I think creating what some people call a safe space is really important. And it's not just about building trust with the participants, but it's also saying, go ahead, speak your mind. You can retract, you can withdraw. No agreements are final until all agreements are final. Let's have a conversation. Let's have a conversation.
And see where it leads.
Let's understand each other. Mm-hmm. And frankly, if you do that, and you learn something new together, or you go through some experiences together, or you find that underneath it all, that you actually agree on a lot more than you realized, it really opens your channels to actually see more agreement. And I think underneath it all, people really want to like each other, most people. They're tired of not liking each other. I find in these rooms, as I watch them from a distance, that people really want to get along. They want to have a relationship. They're tired of hating each other. And yet there's so many forces at work that actually prevents people from building deep relationships. We don't build deep relationships in Washington, the average policy circles. I think members of Congress don't relate to each other as personally as they used to at one time. They travel home too much on the weekends. They don't build those relationships. And that is the grist of allowing conversations that find common ground if you have the will to do so.
That's the foundation. That's the absolute foundation of it. When you think about, I was just thinking about the one of the recent polls that came out actually yesterday, I believe it was, that talked about the rise of anti-Semitism and hate in our country. And you spoke openly just a moment ago about your faith, Judaism. As a man of the Jewish faith, having seen what has gone on in this country over the last few months, particularly, especially with the horrific shooting in the synagogue, what are your thoughts on a personal level about, being in the midst of this work that you are so passionate and so vested in? What are your thoughts about how we move forward as a country, as a society?
Well, big complicated issue, and I, as you know, I'm somebody who kind of wells up when I see traffic lights change. I'm going to well up a little bit. I can feel it. I was in Pittsburgh about 3 weeks before the shootings. First time in my life I've ever been to Pittsburgh. And ironically, I was invited to address 75 Jewish leaders of the Pittsburgh community. So this is the beginning of October. And we even had at our last leadership meeting a young fellow who helps run the community relations council, who runs the community relations council there, who was thrown into the fire, if you will, on this. So I feel a deep connection because some of the people being quoted in the press are people I met that night, and just feel like a connection. And I feel a connection as a Jewish person to that because I can imagine, I've had thoughts, what would this look like in my synagogue? Who would have been shot? And it feels, most of my life I haven't felt so singled out. I've felt blessed to be accepted and to rise to whatever levels I can rise, and I haven't felt it to be a detriment. But once in a while it rears its head. Look, I think the answer is probably going to be similar to what I've already said. At some level, we need to have people who allow us to see ourselves fully for who we are. I think we need to have compassion for people who are full of hate, but we also need to draw a line and make sure that things are unacceptable. We can't be giving signals to people that some behavior may be okay, whether we're doing it on purpose or not. And we need to constantly expose ourselves to understand the truth about other people, whether it's people of different colors or religions or ethnicities or background. Underneath it all, we're profoundly human. And we need a concerted effort to create those bonds so that we see each other for who we are, just as you're trying to do with this podcast. So I don't have anything profound to say beyond what you might say or anyone else might say, but we need our institutions to support that. We need to have dialogue. We need to have a relationship. We need to be mindful of not stereotyping each other. And we need to be very skeptical of people who stereotype each other or treat each other as if they're the other. Because those are people who are acting either out of ignorance or they're working out of some motivation perhaps to get ratings or to get a following. And, I just don't think that's the way the world works. So,
I really believe when you say acting out of ignorance, I think that so much of the hate that is out there is ignorant. It's because people have not been exposed to whoever it is they view as the other. If you grew up in a community where everyone that you saw and conversed with or socialized with looked like you, thought like you, etc., then when you're confronted with someone who is the other, you're much more likely to do this, or say, I'm better than you are. But when you have an opportunity to build a relationship, so often you hear people talk about when I went to college, was the first time I had an opportunity to, live with a white person or live with a Jewish person or live with a Muslim person. And I got to know them. And all of a sudden, everything shifted. So much of it comes down to just basic human relationships.
So I'm with you, and I want to make sure we come across really balanced, that we are really balanced, because I'm also seeing the opposite bias in some ways amongst my liberal friends who view Trump supporters in a generalized way that I think is dangerous. It's the same mentality. It's a natural sense of, trying to hang out with people who you agree with. Some people are calling it tribalism. I've heard that may not be the best word, but you tend to want to relate to people who agree with you. And so you have trouble living with the cognitive dissonance. As someone, if you are a big critic of the president, he certainly is a controversial figure at a minimum. It's hard for you to understand there could be people of great decency who support him. So speaking of people being deplorable and so on, I think is divisive. So it's a natural instinct we have to want to resonate and stay with that. And so we have to stay vigilant on all sides. It's not only about, people are on the progressive side. We all have blinders. I kid my Jewish friends that at some level, because we always feel like we're the minority, and maybe we have over history been oppressed. I think that a lot of Jewish people have blind eyes when it comes to Christianity, to fully understanding the Christian faith. So I don't want to say too much. I'll get in trouble with too many people. But we all inherently, we can't be all things to all people. We can't be universal about everything. We just don't know enough. But to stop for a moment and realize there's always limits to what we know, and give people the benefit of the doubt, I think that's the attitude I'd love to have people carry with them.
And to take that into all of the controversial issues that we're facing as a nation. I know that Convergence, you just enumerated the projects that are on the table right now, the Education Imagined and healthcare, reentry ready, helping to help prisoners re-enter into society so that they don't reoffend. And what was the one that I Economic mobility. Okay, so I know that there are many other issues out there, chief among them gun control and immigration, that are in the front of the national discourse right now. And I know Convergence has been approached about trying to tackle these issues. So what's next?
Well, we don't know for sure, because we have to do our homework and make sure we can make a unique difference and that people want to come to the table. We are looking at the issue of gun safety, gun violence. In fact, how we frame it's important. Gun control.
Safety, gun violence, as opposed to gun control.
Yes, because gun control already sounds like one side or the other.
Words matter,
Yeah, so it's really important. That's a lesson. When you want to have a good conversation with people who disagree, don't frame it in terms that they can feel
that can be more neutral.
They're welcome to the table.
Right.
We're looking at that. We're looking at, Linda, close to you, the role of the media, whether it's social media or media otherwise. We're doing a little research there. Lately, we're putting some attention into the issue of the fact that people are losing faith in the validity of our elections. So could we potentially pull together a group that clarifies, well, how much fraud is there? How much suppression is there? And what are the really acceptable ways people can operate in states to run elections so that everyone eligible can vote and those not eligible don't vote? Could we have a conversation that could shed light and maybe restore public confidence in elections? So we're looking at that. And there are other issues still on the horizon we haven't quite figured out. One that's lively for us is the issue of housing affordability. So we're looking at that too. There's a crisis throughout the country, but particularly in urban areas.
And so to help our audience understand kind of what the process is, it's the research. Go ahead and you fill in the blank for me.
So first you have to identify an issue of national consequence, and then sometimes people come to us, sometimes we originate it. Then we try to figure out, create this map I mentioned before. Well, who believes what? Who would need to talk to whom to make a difference? What are the leverage points? Is it public policy like legislation? Is it companies that need to take action? Is it public-private? Is it changes in philanthropic priorities? So we figure that out. We do our research. And then we figure out, can we get at least a few what we call anchor stakeholders, people whose presence at the table would help bring in other people and give it credibility. And then lastly, like every nonprofit, we have to figure out if we can pay for the
How
damn
do we
thing.
pay for it?
So we look at all that, and it's intensive, and most people don't fund you to do your research like us. I mean, for us, the challenge is that most foundations and others fund really people doing the work they already believe in the results. And us, they're funding a process. The process says that if we bring together these people and reach agreement, we're going to have powerful results that won't compromise anybody. But we can't tell you in advance exactly how we're going to deal with poverty or how we're going to deal with incarceration, even though we often have a pretty good idea. But it's not about us, it's not our ideas, it's the stakeholders. So we go through that process of doing our research, organizing potential stakeholders to sit at a table, facilitating them with ground rules and professional facilitators, and then bringing them not only to agreement on ideas, but to form an action plan they can take on together to help put their ideas into the world. And surprisingly enough, we almost always find common ground, but sometimes we don't actually change the world overnight when we're done. Sometimes we just go out there and fight the good fight, get the ideas out there. And sometimes we have immediate impact. It's a crazy quote. We don't really control the world from where we sit.
If only it were that easy, huh?
Yeah.
If only. Well, I just think that what Convergence is doing is so necessary and so vital to moving us forward as a nation. And I know Convergence isn't the only organization doing this kind of work. There are lots of others out there that are like-minded, and I know that Convergence also partners and works with other organizations along the same lines. If somebody out there listening, watching today wants to get involved with Convergence and support it in some way, how would they go about doing that?
Well, the easiest thing is to go to the website, which is convergencepolicy.org. Take a look at all our programs. Obviously, the easiest thing for people who don't have a lot of spare time is to donate money. But beyond that, we have a leadership council of people from across the country beyond our board of directors that meets regularly. We have lots of people who advise us, who give us tips on who to include at tables or bring project ideas to us. So it's difficult for us to organize massive amounts of volunteers, but if you're passionate about our work, send us a note, give us some ideas. If you've got communication skills, we might put you to work. If you have particular knowledge in a subject area we're looking at, we might want to talk to you. We just want more people to have this mindset. So that's one thing I wanted to also say, Linda. As you know, one of the things we're working on now is we're a small organization. We're now about 25 people. And we're a leverage organization. We bring together all these stakeholders who are powerful on the issues, and they're going to go out and do the work. But we're increasingly focusing on how can we share what we know? How can we inspire others, whether they be at the community level or neighborhood level or at the state level, to use these approaches, collaborative approaches, to achieve results? So we want to both inspire people to use them and support them to do so, because we want to create what we call the multiplier effect. Have lots of people who have this mindset and see there's a possibility of actually solving problems in a way that's powerful and effective, and also builds community and civility in the process. So to the extent people want to know more about our process, we have materials we can share with them. We can also connect them to people who work at the community level in a way that we don't. So we have a lot of, as you say, a lot of partners, and we do rely on these other people. We're not the sole source of this information. There's lots of people who work on it, even though our approach is somewhat unique, that nobody quite does what we do the way we do it.
Well, I'm just am thankful for the day that I met you, and that I had the opportunity to see the great work that you're doing, because the truth is, I personally had been looking for something, for some way to make a contribution to this dialogue, feeling very distressed about where we are in our national discourse, and saying, okay, it would be easy to sit on the sidelines and just say, I wish things would change. But it's like, okay, what can I, as one person, do to help try to change this conversation? This podcast is a part of it, but even beyond that, just being able to be involved at the board level with Convergence and try to use whatever skill sets and connections I have to help move this forward, I am forever grateful for the opportunity. So thank you so much. And I'm just going to ask you one last question, and that is, if there were one thing that you could say to our audience that you would want them to take with them to help our nation heal and come back together, what would that be?
What I'd say to them is give each other the benefit of the doubt. Listen to each other. Try to see things through new eyes. When you hear something that you find disagreeable, find the most reasonable person who has those views, rather than the person who's the messenger you hate, and consider all those different points of view. I'm not talking about tolerating extremes, people who are full of hate. I think that's somehow at odds with their fundamental nature. But there's lots of room for decent people to disagree. So I would urge people to, take a deep breath, try to consider the humanity of that person. We're all part of the same larger family. And when you can, try to open your mind to seeing them differently and seeing them in their own shoes. And let me also close by thanking you for this. You're an unbelievable example of someone who just came in, volunteered, and brings talent to us. You asked me the question before. If people are out there and they have an idea, how do we take these ideas out to other people? If they have ideas about, how to run a nonprofit better, if they have ideas about how we could take these processes to local communities better, if they have any ideas, people who come in and lend the talent that you do and others, that's how we build this organization. We are very much about asking everybody to model what we preach to the outside world, that we collaborate and we leverage the talents of people. So I want to thank you for this opportunity and for all you already are bringing to Convergence's success.
Well, thank you, Rob. And I look forward to continuing to work with you. And we will definitely have you back to give us more updates as Convergence's work progresses. And you're celebrating your 10th anniversary next year. Or
Right.
I say we are celebrating our 10th anniversary next year. So I'm really excited about that. It's going to be fun.
Well, if you invite me back, because I'm Convergence, I'll have a chance to give you views opposing to what I gave today.
That sounds like a plan.
Okay.
So thanks again, Rob. Thank you all so much for taking the time to allow our guest to speak, for giving him permission to speak, and for you having the courage to listen with an open mind. And my hope is that you will take that mindset with you as you go forward. Thanks again for tuning in. We'll see you next time. I'm Linda Lorelle. Bye-bye. I'm a firm believer that if we can find a way to better understand each other's experiences, we can find a way to respect and accept each other for who we are, even when we don't agree. That's the ultimate goal of this podcast. So with that in mind, what do you want the world to know about your story? How might your story, your truth, provide a different, important perspective and help bridge our divides? If you'd like to share your story with us and have a chance to be on the podcast, all you have to do is go to our website, ourvoicesmatterpodcast.com, and click on What's Your Story? We can't wait to hear from you because your voice matters.